The galaxy is not a battlefield. It is a feeding ground. Since the dawn of the species, humanity has deluded itself into believing it holds the title of apex. We build walls of adamantium, we wield the fire suns, and we convince ourselves that we are the masters of our own demise. But there are laws older than the Imperium, older than the Chaos Gods. There is the law of the hunt. On the Death World of Catachan, survival is not a given. It is a violent negotiation with nature itself. Here, the flora thirsts for blood, and the fauna can tear a tank asunder. It is a hellscape that breeds the toughest soldiers the Astra Militarum has ever known. But tonight, something new stalks the green hell. It is not of the warp. It is not a mindless devourer of biomass. It is a silent king of a different breed, an alien scholar of death, seeking the ultimate trophy. Tonight, the jungle does not hunt the men. The anathema has arrived, and it has come to claim the skulls of the galaxy's greatest survivors. The air in the Devil's Armpit sector didn't just sit in your lungs. It fought for space, heavy with a copper tang of blood moss and the suffocating humidity of a world that wanted you dead. Sergeant Snake. Bite wiped a grime-streaked hand across his brow, flicking away a mixture of sweat and condensation that pooled beneath his red bandana. At 40 degrees Celsius, the Catachan jungle was a steam bath powered by a dying sun, but Snake didn't flinch. His muscles, corded and scarred like the roots of the iron-bark trees surrounding him, remained tense, reading the vibrations of the ground through the soles of his boots. He adjusted the strap of his Mark IV Lascarbine, the weapon's casing stripped of all non-essential plating to save weight and reduce snagging. Around him, Squad Delta moved with the predatory grace of apex hunters, a silent procession of olive-drab muscle and ceramite. They were not marching. They were flowing through the undergrowth, disturbing nothing, leaving no boot prints in the most decay of the forest floor. Here, silence was not just discipline. It was the only armor that mattered. To make a sound in the green, hell was to ring a dinner bell for 1,000 nightmares, and Snake had no intention of feeding the local wildlife today. "Hold," Snake whispered, the sound barely rising above the chittering of the stingwings buzzing around his ears. He raised a clenched fist, and the squad froze instantly, blending perfectly into the riots of green and brown foliage. Behind him, Trooper Vance, the squad's Vox operator, checked his Auspex scanner, frowning at the static that washed over the green screen. The jungle played havoc with machine spirits. The interference from high-density spore clouds made long-range comms nearly impossible. "Readings are ghostly, Sarge," Vance murmured, tapping the side of the device. "Thermal spikes everywhere. The heat in this sector is masking everything." Snake nodded grimly. That was the way of Catachan. It blinded your tech, dulled your senses, and exhausted your body before the enemy even fired a shot. To his left, Heavy Harkin shifted the weight of his massive heavy bolter, the ammo belt clinking softly against his flak vest. They were deep in the patrol zone, miles from the nearest fire base, hunting for rumored orcs that had been raiding the perimeter. But the jungle felt wrong today. It was too quiet. The usual cacophony of screeching death monkeys and ripping toads was muted, as if the forest itself was holding its breath in anticipation of violence. Without warning, the vegetation to their right exploded in a blur of motion. It wasn't an orc. It was a brain-leaf frond, a carnivorous plant sensing the vibrations of their heartbeats. A vine as thick as a man's thigh whipped out, seeking to latch on to Harkin's neck, and bore into his nervous system. Snake moved before the thought fully formed in his mind. In one fluid motion, he drew his 20-inch Catachan Fong, a blade forged from hyperdense steel, and severed the vine in midair. The plant shrieked, a high-pitched, wet sound that resembled a dying child, spraying acidic sap across the ground where Harkin had been standing a split second before. "Watch your spacing," Snake barked, his voice abandoning stealth for command authority. "The flora is agitated. Something stirred the nest." The squad fell into a defensive rosette, las guns raised, scanning the canopy. This was the daily reality of their existence. The flora was just as likely to kill you as a bolter round. But the aggression of the plant was unusual. Brain leaves were usually ambush predators, not berserkers. Whatever had passed through here recently had put the entire ecosystem on a war footing. They pushed forward, hacking through a wall of razor vine, until they reached a small clearing illuminated by a shaft of harsh sunlight piercing the canopy. In the center of the clearing hung the carcass of a grox, a reptilian beast of burden used for hauling heavy ordnance. But this grox had not been killed by a predator of this world. It hung upside down, suspended by a loop of indiscernible wire tied to a high branch, swinging gently in the hot breeze. Snake approached it cautiously, his nose wrinkling not at the smell of rot, but at the smell of ozone and cauterized flesh. The beast had been skinned, not eaten, not torn apart by the jagged teeth of a Catachan devil, but flayed with surgical, mechanical precision. The skin had been removed in a single piece, and the skull had been polished clean of meat. "Throne preserve us," Vance whispered, lowering his lost gun. "What is that?" "Orcs eat the meat. Tyranids consume the biomass. This is a trophy." Snake ran a finger along the exposed ribcage of the beast. The bone was scorched. Directed energy weapon. High yield. "No wildlife did this," Snake growled, looking up into the dense, dark canopy above them. "And no orc has the patience." Night fell like a hammer blow on Catachan, the temperature dropping only slightly as the bioluminescent fungi began to glow with a sickly purple hue. Squad Delta set up a perimeter in the roots of a massive twisting tree, the darkness pressing in around them. The jungle, usually a riot of noise at night, remained unsettlingly subdued. Snake took the first watch, sitting with his back against the bark, his eyes scanning the darkness with the intensity of a hawk. He lit a low stick, shielding the ember with his cupped hand, the smoke mixing with the thick fog rolling in from the swamps. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was a primal itch at the base of his skull, a sensation he hadn't felt since the campaigns against the lictors on Tyran Prime. But this was different. It felt colder, calculated. High above in the tree lean, invisible to the naked eye and masked by the heat of the jungle, a pair of yellow, glowing eyes watched the ember of the low stick. A low, clicking growl vibrated through the leaves, lost in the wind. The game had been found. The board was set, and the pieces were unaware that the dice had already been rolled. High above the stratospheric filth of Catachan, where the orbital debris of 1,000 failed invasions drifted like a graveyard of metal, a single sliver of silver detached itself in the shadow of a passing asteroid. It was not a vessel of the Imperial Navy, nor the ramshackle scrapcraft of the Orc marauders who frequently plagued the system. It was a drop pod of elegant, brutal geometry, forged from a dark alloy that drank the light of the stars. It pierced the atmosphere with the violence of a spear thrust, wreathed in ionization flames that mimicked chaotic entry of a meteor. Down below, the jungle canopy swallowed the impact. There was no massive crater, no mushroom cloud, only a precise, thunderous thud that shook the roots of the iron bark trees for a mile in every direction, as the superheated hull hissed in the swamp water, cooling rapidly with the sound of a dying serpent. The hydraulic seals disengaged. There was no ramp, no fanfare. The hatch simply dissolved into the humid air, and from the darkness of the pod, a figure emerged. It stood 7 feet tall, armored in a mesh that rippled like liquid mercury. It did not step into the mud. It stepped onto the hunt. Initialization sequence complete. The world snapped into existence, not through the limited spectrum of organic eyes, but through the high-definition, multi-layered sensory overload of the biomask. The Yautja drew a breath of the superheated air, the mask's filtration systems instantly analyzing the chemical composition, nitrogen, oxygen, heavy spore density, trace amounts of promethium, and the pheromones of fear. The visual overlays cycled rapidly. Thermal vision, useless. The jungle was a washing machine of heat. The ambient temperature was so high that the trees and the ground glowed with the same intensity as living flesh. The display washed out in blinding white and angry orange. The hunter clicked its mandibles in annoyance and adjusted the input. Tech mode /ultraviolet. The chaos receded. Now, the world was a landscape of cool blues and sharp violets. The pulsing bioelectricity of the flora stood out like neon veins. It could see the magnetic fields of the planet, the distant energy signatures of the human weapons, and the beating hearts of a million hidden predators. This world was alive in a way few planets were. It was a crucible, a perfect arena. The hunter leaped, covering 30 feet in a single bound, landing silently on a moss-slicked branch high in the canopy. From this vantage point, it locked onto the energy signatures it had tracked from orbit. Below, moving through the green gloom, was the prey. The biomass zoomed in, the reticle spinning and locking onto the heat haze of the leading human, the one called Snake. The display scrolled with alien glyphs, calculating bone density, muscle mass, and weapon lethality. These were not the soft, doughy humans of the hive cities the hunter had seen before. These creatures were hardened leather and scarred tissue. The weapon carried by the leader was crude but effective, a laser carbine capable of punching through light armor. The large one, the heavy gunner, carried a weapon that fired mass-reactive explosives. Threat level, high. Prey status, worthy. The Yautja felt the thrill of the chemicals flooding its bloodstream. To hunt the weak was a chore. To hunt the strong was a sacrament. It reached to its left gauntlet and keyed a sequence. The air around it bent, refracted, and then vanished. The hunter was gone, replaced only by a shimmering distortion in the heat, a ghost made of light and intent. A vibration in the tree trunk interrupted the analysis. Something massive was moving up the bark, ignoring the laws of gravity. The hunter turned its head, the motion sensors whining softly. Emerging from the gloom was a nightmare of chitin and legs, a juvenile Catachan devil, the size of a Terran transport vehicle. Its many eyes were black beads of hunger, and its mandibles dripped with neurotoxic sludge. It had sensed the intruder not by sight, but by the displacement of air. The devil lunged, a blur of segmented armor and pincers, screeching a sound that would shatter a human eardrum. The Yautja did not fire its plasma caster. To use energy weapons now would be an insult to the combat. Instead, the twin serrated wrist blades extended from his right gauntlet with metallic shing. As the beast crashed into the branch, the hunter sidestepped with fluid grace, driving the blades upward. The metal met the chitin of a Death World apex predator. Sparks flew, followed by a spray of thick green ichor. The Catachan devil thrashed, its tail whipping around to crush the alien, but the hunter was faster, stronger, and infinitely more disciplined. The struggle was brief but violent. The Yautja mounted the back of the thrashing arachnid, riding the bucking monster as it tore through the canopy. With a guttural roar that was amplified by the mask, the hunter drove the wrist blades down to the base of the creature's skull, severing the nerve cluster. The devil went limp, crashing to the lower branches and thudding heavily into the mud below. The hunter landed atop it, boots planted on the cracked carapace. It ripped the blades free, shaking off the green gore. It looked down at the dead beast, then back toward the direction of the human squad. This scorpion thing was strong, yes, but it was an animal. It fought with instinct, not intellect. The humans, they fought with cunning. They had traps. They had communication. They had the capacity for cruelty. The hunter engaged its vocal mimicry unit, recording the dying screech of the Catachan devil and replaying it at a low, threatening pitch. The warm-up was over. The calibration was complete. The Yautja turned its masked gaze toward the fading heat signatures of Squad Delta. The trophy wall awaited new additions. Get dark. It got heavy. The squad had pushed into a low-lying depression the maps called the Gullet, a sunken mire where the humidity condensed into a fog, so thick it felt like wading through promethium jelly. Trooper Vance gripped his lost gun with white-knuckled intensity, the strap biting into his shoulder. As a comms officer, his world was usually defined by the reassuring chatter of the Vox network, the digital heartbeat of the Imperial Guard. But now, the Vox was dead, not the static of interference, but a hollow, abyssal silence that made his skin crawl. The blind man's breath. The veterans called this fog. It swallowed light and sound alike. Vance couldn't see Sergeant Snake, who was only 3 meters ahead, save for the faint glow of the lum strip on the back of his flak armor. The silence was unnatural. The cicadas had stopped. The distant roar of the Grox herds had cut out. It was as if the jungle itself had pulled the covers up over its head, terrified of what was walking through the mist. Vance checked his auspex again. The screen washed with ghost signals, phantom blips that danced and vanished like spirits. "Keep it tight," Snake's voice drifted back, sounding swallowed and small. "Check your 6. Something's tracking the heat wake. Vance turned to check on Heavy Harkin, the rear guard. Harkin was the anchor of the squad, a mountain of a man who treated his heavy bolter like a pistol. Harkin, sound off. Vance whispered into his microbead. There was no response, just the damp hiss of the fog. Vance stopped, turning fully around. Harkin. He took a step back into Gray's suit. Harkin, don't muck about. He expected a gruff insult, a joke about Vance's mother, or the metallic clank of the ammo feed. Instead, his boot struck something hard on the soft mud. He looked down. It was the heavy bolter. The weapon had been sheared cleanly in half. The barrel lay in the muck, the edges glowing with a fading orange heat, as if sliced by a laser of impossible intensity. But Harkin was gone. There was no blood spray, no drag marks, no struggle. A man weighing 300 pounds in full kit had simply evaporated into the air. Vance felt a cold spike of adrenaline punch through his gut. "Contact!" he screamed, the word tearing his throat. "Man down! Harkin is gone!" The discipline of Catachan kicked in instantly, overriding the panic. "Castle in formation. Circle up. Back to back." Snake roared, his voice cutting through the fog. The remaining 6 troopers snapped together, their backs pressing against one another. Lost guns raised outward into the swirling gray. They were a porcupine of lost fire, waiting for a target. But there was nothing to shoot, just a swirling mist and the drip, drip, drip of condensation falling from the canopy. Then they heard it. From the darkness to the left, a voice spoke. "Vance, check Euro 6. It was Snake's voice. It had the same gravelly timbre, the same cadence. But it was wrong. It was tinny, fragmented, like a corrupt audio file being played back on a damaged Voxcaster. Vance froze. He could feel Sergeant Snake's back pressed against his own. "Sarge." Vance whispered, his eyes widening. Snake stiffened. "That wasn't me, trooper," Snake hissed, his knuckle whitening on his blade. The voice came again, closer this time, moving with impossible speed to their right flank. "Man down. Harkin gone." It was mocking them, parroting their fear. The realization hit Vance with the force of physical blow. The enemy was listening. It was learning. "Show yourself, you bastards." Trooper Gator yelled, his nerve cracking under the psychological assault. He fired a burst of lost fire into the shadows where the voice had come from. The red beams hissed through the fog, illuminating nothing but wet leaves. But as the afterimage of the lasers faded, Vance saw it. High up in the crook of an iron bark tree, about 20 meters away, the air rippled. It looked like heat haze rising from a tarmac, a distortion in the shape of a humanoid. For a split second, the camouflage faltered, perhaps resetting after a movement. 2 glowing yellow eyes, cold and reptilian, burned through the distortion. Then 3 red dots arranged in a perfect triangle appeared on Gator's chest. They tracked his breathing, rising and falling with his panicked gasps. "Gator, get down." Vance screamed, lunging forward. He was too late. A bolt of superheated plasma, shining like a miniature sun, erupted from the trees. It hit Gator's center mass, vaporizing his flak armor and the flesh beneath in a blinding flash of blue-white light. The thunderclap of the discharge deafened them, and the smell of ozone and cooked meat instantly flooded the clearing. Chaos erupted. The squad opened fire, a frantic light show of red lost beams tearing into the canopy, shredding leaves and branches. Control, fire discipline. Snake bellowed, hauling Vance back into the circle. "Vance, get battalion. Get U.S. air support. Now!" Vance fumbled with the long-range Voxcaster on his back, cranking the frequency dial with trembling fingers. He slammed the headset over his ears. "Command, this is Delta. We are under attack by unknown Xenos. We have casualties. Requesting immediate." He stopped. The channel wasn't dead anymore. It was alive with cacophony of clicking, guttural purring, and a low, rhythmic thrumming that sounded like a heartbeat. The enemy was jamming the frequency, not with noise, but with its own alien code. The display on his Vox unit flickered, the Imperial Aquila symbol glitching and twisting into jagged, alien runes. Vance looked up at Snake, his face pale, the reflection of the burning jungle dancing in his eyes. "They've cut the line, Sarge," he whispered, the true horror of their situation settling in. "We're not fighting a soldier. We're fighting a hunter. And we're in the cage. Cease fire. God Emperor damn you. Cease fire." Snake's voice cracked like a whip, cutting through the panic. The lost fire sputtered and died, leaving the smell of ozone hanging thick in the humid air. The jungle was silent again, save for the sizzling of superheated sap dripping from the ruined branches above. Snake grabbed Trooper Vance by the chest plate, slamming him against the trunk of a moss-choked tree. "Look at me!" Snake hissed, his eyes wide and feral. The pupils dilated. "You are firing at ghosts. You are firing at the wind. That is what it wants." He let go, turning to the rest of the terrified squad. They were reacting like conscripts, not Catachans. The fear of the unknown had stripped them of their heritage. "It's using the trees," Snake said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "It sees our heat. It hears our comms. We can't out-tech this bastard. We are trying to fight a void war in the mud." He reached down, scooped up a handful of cold, cloying river clay, and smeared it thick over his face and neck, masking his skin. "So we stop being soldiers. We start being Catachans. We go cold. We go silent. We hunt." The squad moved with a renewed, grim purpose. They were no longer patrolling. They were setting a kill box. They fell back to a narrow choke point between two massive root systems, a natural funnel where the enemy would be forced to descend from the canopy to track them. Snake directed the preparations with hand signals only. No words. No vox. "Trooper twitch." The demolitions expert unspooled a tripwire made of monofilament line, invisible to naked eye and hard for thermal sensors to pick up against the ambient heat of the ground. He rigged a cluster of cracking grenades, high-yield armor-piercing explosives, usually reserved for orc dreadnoughts, at knee height. Behind the kill zone, the squad dug in, burying themselves under layers of fern and mulch until they were indistinguishable from the forest floor. Snake positioned himself as the bait, sitting openly against a rock, feigning a leg injury, his lost gun resting visibly on his lap. It was the oldest trick in the book, the wounded gazelle. But this gazelle had a combat knife hidden in his boot and a heart full of cold fury. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. The jungle insects began to buzz again, a sign that the immediate chaos had settled. Then the insects went silent once more. Snake felt the hair on his arm stand up. He didn't look up. He stared at the reflection in a small pool of water near his boots. High above, the leaves parted. There was no sound of movement, but the stars were being blocked out by distortion, a rippling emptiness that descended branch by branch. The hunter was arrogant. It saw a lone, wounded human, separated from the pack. It dropped from the canopy, landing with a heavy, wet thud 10 meters from Snake. The water in the puddle rippled. The distortion stepped forward. Click! The tripwire snapped. The jungle erupted in a deafening roar as the Kraken grenades detonated. The blast wasn't fireball. It was a concussion of pure force and shrapnel designed to crack ceramite. The shockwave knocked Snake flat against the rock, ringing his ears, but he saw what he needed to see. The explosion had shorted out the creature's cloaking field. Electricity arced violently across the invisible silhouette, revealing the monster within, a towering, reptilian humanoid clad in strange bronze armor, roaring in pain. "Hit it! Hit it now!" Snake roared, scrambling to his feet. The squad erupted from the ground like vengeance incarnate. Lost fire poured into the smoke, this time finding a solid target. The creature was fast, impossibly fast, but it was hurt. A lost bolt caught in the shoulder, burning through the mesh armor. Another grazed its thigh. The alien let out a guttural, clicking scream and fired its shoulder cannon blindly, vaporizing a tree trunk, before launching itself back into the canopy with a desperate leap. It didn't vanish this time. The cloak was sparking and failing. Snake ran to the impact site. The mud was splattered with a glowing neon green fluid. It pulsed with bioluminescence in the dark, looking like liquid reactor fuel. Snake dipped a finger in the glowing blood, rubbing it between his thumb and forefinger. It was viscous and hot. He looked up at his squad, a savage grin breaking through the mud on his face. The fear was gone. "It bleeds," Snake said, wiping the glowing slime on his chest plate like war paint. "If it bleeds, we can kill it. Track the trail. Don't let up." They followed the glowing trail for a mile, moving with the relentless stamina that only Death Worlders possessed. The green drops led them deeper into the boneyards, a section of jungle where the trees grew gray and twisted. Finally, they found the creature's forward operating base. It wasn't a bunker, it was a shrine. A massive, hollowed-out tree trunk had been converted into a gruesome display case. The squad stopped, their breath catching in their throats. Hanging from the branches by spinal cords were skulls. Dozens of them. Snake recognized the elongated, jagged jaw of an orc knob, the smooth, crystalline structure of an Eldar bone singer. There was even the gargantuan, acid-pitted skull of a Tyranid warrior. But at the center of the display, fresh and glistening wet, was a human skull. The bone was white, but the back of the cranium was still attached to a bloody spinal column. It was Harkin. The creature hadn't just killed him, it had processed him. It was a trophy. Snake stared at the skull of his friend, and the cold calculation in his heart turned into a blazing inferno of hatred. This wasn't war. This was sport. And the Catachans had just decided to change the rules. The silence of the Catachan night was not broken by the snap of a twig or the roar of a beast, but by the screaming of the heavens themselves. The clouds above the devil's armpit boiled away as a shape of absolute, geometric malice descended from a void. It was a Corvus Black Star, the gunship of the Deathwatch, painted in the void black of the Inquisition and stamped with the silver skull of the Ordo Xenos. Its twin assault cannons cycled with mechanical whine that sent the local fauna scattering into the deep brush. The backwash from its vector thrusters flattened the canopy, snapping century-old iron bark trees like dry kindling and turning the swamp water into a scalding mist. Sergeant Snakebite shielded his eyes against the gale, watching as the massive machine hovered just above the treeline, its ramp lowering with a hydraulic hiss that sounded like the breath of a dragon. The Catachans did not cheer. To a jungle fighter, this was not salvation. It was an intrusion. The sky gods had arrived, bringing with them the thunder that drowned out the subtle, necessary noises of survival. Snake spat a glob of blood-streaked phlegm into the mud. "They're loud," he muttered to Vance. "Loud gets you killed." The deployment was a study in transhuman brutality. For figures descended from the ramp, not with the cautious grace of the Catachans, but with the earth-shaking weight of falling anvils. They hit the swamp floor, and the mud did not swallow them. It seemed to recoil. Leading them was Watch Captain Titus, a giant clad in black power armor, his left pauldron bearing the golden inverted omega of the Ultramarines. He was a monument to war, his bolter magnetically locked to his thigh, his helm's lenses glowing a piercing crimson. Flanking him were three others, each a distinct avatar of violence chosen from the finest chapters of the Adeptus Astartes. There was Brother Ignis of Salamanders, his armor adorned with drakeskin and carrying a heavy flamer that smelled of promethium even when cold. To his right, Brother Corvus of the Raven Guard, a shadow made manifest, his armor matte black and silent. And finally, the savage silhouette of Brother Valgr the Space Wolves, his armor hung with wolf-tail talismans, his helmet removed to reveal a face scarred by frost and claw, testing the air with a nose that could track a drop of blood across a blizzard. They were the Death Watch. They were the galaxy's immune system, and they had come to excise a pathogen. Snake approached the demigods, his human frame dwarfed by the towering mass of the Astartes. He didn't bow. On Catachan, you only kneel to check for tripwires. He walked up to Captain Titus, wiping his muddy hands on his trousers. "We didn't call for a pickup," Snake said, his voice raspy but steady. Titus looked down, the servos in his neck armor whirring softly. The size difference was comical, a child standing before a statue, but the tension was palpable. "The Ordo Xenos monitors all unclassified energy signatures," Titus rumbled, his voice sounding like tectonic plates shifting. "Your sector emitted a distress signal, encoded with engagement data. You found something, Sergeant, something that does not belong." Titus gestured to the surrounding jungle, his motion sensors sweeping the perimeter. "This world is a death trap. But the predator you face is not of this ecosystem. We are here to ensure it does not leave. Snake narrowed his eyes. It's a hunter. It skins men for sport. Titus nodded slowly, a grim respect entering his tone. Then we shall see how it fares against the ultimate prey. Brother Valgard moved away from the group, ignoring the tactical briefing. He was drawn to the glowing green slime that Snake had marked on the trees. The space wolf crouched, his massive ceramite boots sinking into the loam. He dipped a gauntlet finger into the residue, bringing it close to his exposed face. He inhaled deeply, his nostrils flaring. "It smells old," Valgard growled, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the chests of the nearby Catachans. "Not the rot of Nurgle, not the musk of the orc, and it lacks the hunger of the Tyrannid." He stood up, turned to look at the trophy tree where Harkin's skull still hung. "It smells of dry stars and cold iron. It is a warrior scent." He looked at Titus. "It has honor, brother captain. It left the weapons. It took only the head." Valgard bared his fangs in a humorless grin. "A duelist? It seeks a challenge." Ignis, the salamander, hefted his flamer. "Then we shall bring it to fire," he said, his voice deep and warm like a furnace. "We will burn the jungle until there is nowhere left to hide." 2 kilometers away, perched high atop a spire of rock that overlooked the valley, the predator watched. The biomask zoomed in, the lenses cycling rapidly through the spectrums. The heat signatures it saw now were blindingly intense. These new arrivals were not like the softskins it had been hunting. Their hearts beat twice as fast. Their blood was laced with potent chemicals. Their armor was powered by fusion cores that shone like beacons in the thermal vision. The Yautja stood, the thrill of the hunt escalating into something approaching religious ecstasy. The hard meat had arrived. The Astartes were legendary game. Tales of their prowess were whispered in the hunting lodges of Yautja Prime. To claim the skull of the Space Marine was to earn a place among the elders. The predator threw back its head and let out a roar, not a challenge, but a declaration. It tapped the gauntlet on its wrist, deactivating the plasma caster. It would not need the cannon for this. For these titans, it would use the spear and the blade. The hunt had just begun in earnest. Brother Corvus of the Raven Guard did not walk. He drifted, a specter of matte black ceramite slipping through the gaps in reality. While the rest of the kill team advanced with the inexorable weight of glacier, Corvus had engaged his jump pack's passive grav suspenders, allowing him to move through the canopy with the silence of a falling feather. He was the point man, the shadow cast by the Emperor's light, and he was hunting a ghost. His auto senses were pushed to the limit, filtering out the screaming of the jungle insects to focus on a singular anomaly, a displacement of air that defied the wind. He found it 50 meters ahead, a blurred patch of nothingness that hopped from an iron bark branch to a vine loop. It was bait. Corvus knew it was bait, just as a spider knows the vibration of its web. But the sons of Coryx do not fear the trap. They dismantle it. He signaled his battle brothers with a single, sharp click over the Vox, then broke formation, propelling himself upward into the dense foliage. He was alone now, suspended in the dark, green cathedral of the upper canopy. The silence stretched, taut as a bowstring, until the air behind him shimmered. The hunter had become the hunted. The attack came not from above, but from the periphery of vision, a blur of motion faster than a mortal mind could process. But Corvus was transhuman. His reaction was not a thought. It was a reflex honed by 2 centuries of war. He spun, his lightning claws igniting with a crackling roar of blue energy, intercepting the descending strike. Clang. The sound was deafening, the ringing of a church bell struck by a thunderbolt. The Yautja serrated wrist blades locked against the energized talons of the Astartes. Sparks, white-hot and blinding, cascaded down into the swamp below. For a second, the 2 combatants hung in a deadlock of raw strength. Corvus looked into the shimmering outline of his foe, his helmet's tactical display struggling to lock onto the distortion. The alien was strong, shockingly so. It held back the press of Terminator-grade hydraulics with biological muscle alone. The Yautja decloaked in a wash of electrical static, revealing its masked face inches from Corvus's helm. It tilted its head, a guttural clicking emanating from its throat. Then, With a twisted acrobatic grace that mocked the laws of physics, it disengaged, flipping backward off the branch and landing on a higher perch. It didn't flee. It crouched, extending its claws, inviting the Space Marine to dance. Contact. North Quadrant. Brothers, purge the area. The voice of Brother Ignis boomed to the jungle, followed by the heavy, rhythmic thudding of running Astartes. The salamander burst through the undergrowth below, looking up to see the duel in the trees. He did not bother with precision aiming. The salamanders were born of fire, and they understood that fire reveals all truths. Ignis braced his feet in the mud, leveled his heavy flamer, and squeezed the trigger. Into the fires of battle, unto the anvil of war, he roared. A torrent of liquid promethium, burning at temperatures that could melt rock, surged upward. It was a dragon's breath, washing over the canopy, turning the wet jungle into an instant inferno. The steam explosion was massive, blinding and scalding. Leaves instantly turned to ash, and the water in the air evaporated with shriek. The fire did its job. High above, the heat overwhelmed the Yautja's cloaking matrix. The shimmer failed completely, revealing the tall, armored figure silhouetted against a wall of orange flame. It was exposed. The predator did not panic. It was a veteran of 1,000 hunts, and fire was an element it understood. As the flames licked at its bronze armor, the alien tapped a command into its wrist computer. The shoulder-mounted plasma caster swiveled with a mechanical whine, the tri-beam laser locking onto the source of the fire. Brother Ignis. The Yautja fired. A sphere of blue-white plasma, hot as the core of a star, shrieked through the air. Ignis saw it coming and twisted his torso, presenting his pauldron to the blast. The impact was catastrophic. The plasma bolt slammed into the ceramite shoulder guard, vaporizing the outer layers instantly. The force of the blow knocked the 300-kilogram Astartes off his feet, sending him crashing into the burning brush. His armor held, barely, but the pauldron was a slag ruin, glowing cherry red and dripping molten metal onto the mud. Target. Potent. Ignis grunted over the Vox, his bio-monitor flashing amber warnings. The weapon was not a simple laser. It was a plasma caster that rivaled the Imperium's own ancient technology. Watch Captain Titus and Valgar the Wolf broke into the clearing, bolters raised, seeking a target. But the Yautja was already moving. It had tested the metal of the Astartes and found them to be formidable. Melee with the Shadow Walker was risky. The Firebearer was resilient. The Wolf and the Captain were closing in. The odds were no longer favorable for a localized skirmish. The Predator leaped, clearing 30 meters in a single bound, disappearing into the smoke and steam of the burning jungle. It did not retreat out of fear, but out of tactical necessity. This was no longer a hunt for trophies. It was a war for survival. As it vanished, a metallic object detached from its belt. A smart disc. The disc hovered for a split second before spinning up with a high-pitched whine, launching itself not at the Marines, but cutting through the supporting trunk of a massive tree above them. The giant hardwood groaned and began to fall, crashing down to separate the Marines and cover the aliens' escape. Titus watched the tree fall, his bolter lowering. "It is smart," he said, the respect in his voice undeniable. "It is learning how we fight." Valgar laughed, a savage bark. "Good. A dumb beast offers no glory." The Yautja crouched on a limestone ridge overlooking the smoldering crater of the previous engagement, its breath coming in ragged, clicking gasps. The Astartes fire weapon had been effective. The biomesh on its left flank was fused to its skin, and the smell of its own cauterized flesh filled the masked filtration unit. With a stoic, ritualistic calm, the hunter activated its metacomp. The device hissed, injecting a coagulating gel that burned with the cold intensity of liquid nitrogen into the wound. The Yautja roared, a sound dampened by the mask, as the flesh knit together in agonizing seconds. It was preparing to re-engage, to hunt the Firebearer who had marked it, when the sensory input on its HUD spiked crimson. It wasn't a thermal signature. It was a seismic event. The ridge beneath its feet trembled, dust shaking loose from the rocks. This was not the rhythmic thud of the Astartes' boots, nor the aftershock of explosives. It was a deep, tectonic grinding, as if the planet itself was waking up to crush the parasites on its surface. The jungle floor, 300 meters below, began to bulge upward. The roots of ancient trees snapped with the sound of cannon fire. The noise of the battle had not just attracted the attention of the Space Marines. It had rung the dinner bell for the true master of this domain. The earth detonated. Soil, rock, and shattered timber were blasted skyward as the Catachan Devil Matriarch erupted from the subterranean depths. It was a leviathan of chitin and muscle, a centipede scorpion hybrid the size of an armored freight train. Its segmented carapace was the color of dried blood and encased in armor plates thick enough to deflect light anti-tank weaponry. Countless legs, each tipped with side blade capable of shearing through flak armor, churned the mud into a quagmire. Its head was a nightmare of multiple mandibles and cluster eyes that burned with a mindless, insatiable hunger. The Yautja watched from the high ground, its biomask struggling to calculate the sheer biomass of creature. Threat level, Omega. This was not a beast to be hunted. It was a force of nature to be survived. The Astartes, positioned near the impact zone, were instantly thrown onto the defensive. The matriarch let out a shriek that cracked the glass of the Yautja's wrist display, a sonic weapon in its own right, before lunging with terrifying speed toward the source of the shiny, ceramite-clad morsels. The valley dissolved into a chaotic three-way war. The Deathwatch opened fire, their bolters roaring in unison. Mass reactive shells detonated against the matriarch's carapace, blowing chunks of chitin the size of shields into the air, but the beast didn't slow down. It swept its massive tail, catching Brother Valgor mid-stride and batting the space wolf through a grove of trees like a rag doll. The Yautja saw an opportunity. It did not fire at the beast. Instead, it sprinted along the ridge, leaping into the void with a calculated trajectory. It landed not on the ground, but on the back of the thrashing matriarch. The creature bucked wildly, trying to dislodge the alien passenger, but the predator drove its twin wrist blades deep into the soft tissue between the armor plates, anchoring itself. It was riding the storm. From this vantage point, the Yautja became a conductor of the chaos, goading the beast with precise stabs, steering its pain and rage toward the kill team. It was a gamble of insane proportions, riding a localized earthquake into the teeth of the Emperor's angels. Below, the situation was critical. Captain Titus stood his ground, his power sword-drawn, parrying a strike from one of the matriarch's auxiliary grasping claws. The sheer weight of the creature was driving the Astartes into the mud. Concentrate fire on the eyes. Titus bellowed over the Vox, his voice strained by the effort of holding back tons of alien muscle. Brother Ignis unleashed a stream of promethium at the beast's face, but the creature recoiled, thrashing blindly. The predator, clinging to the dorsal plates, saw the opening. It uncloaked fully, roaring a challenge at the Space Marine captain, and prepared to drive its combi stick through the beast's brain to crash the massive carcass directly onto Titus. The Yautja raised a spear, the muscles in its arm bunching for the killing thrust. It was the perfect checkmate. The beast would fall, the captain would be crushed, and the trophy would be claimed from the wreckage. But the Yautja had miscalculated one variable, the resolve of a Catachan. From the undergrowth, a small, mud-caked figure sprinted into the kill zone. It was Sergeant Snakebite. He wasn't running away. He was running toward the Titan. He carried a satchel charge of high-grade demolition explosives, the fuse already sputtering. "Eat this, you ugly bastard." Snake screamed, diving not a predator, but underneath the rising thorax of the matriarch, directly beneath where Titus was pinned. He jammed the charge into a soft, exposed vent in the creature's underbelly and drew his knife, looking up at the falling claw. Boom! The explosion was muffled, wet, and devastating. The matriarch's midsection ruptured from the inside out, blowing a geyser of green ichor and viscera across the clearing. The shock wave lifted the beast, and the predator riding it, throwing them violently to the side. The creature collapsed, thrashing in its death throes. But where Snake had been, there was only a crater and a shredded red bandana floating in a pool of alien blood. The predator picked itself up from the mud, looking at the spot where the human had vanished. The small warrior had sacrificed his existence to save the giant. The Yautja clicked its mandibles slowly. Respect. The game had changed. This was no longer just a hunt. It was a blood debt. The carcass of the Catachan Devil Matriarch lay like a ruined mountain range in the center of the clearing, its chitinous plate still twitching with post-mortem spasms. The air was thick with the copper stench of Astartes' blood mixed with the acidic reek of the alien. The kill team was broken. Brother Valgr dragged his leg, his greaves rent open by the beast's crushing claw, servomotors whining in protest with every step. Brother Ignis was weaponless, his heavy flamer crushed in the melee, now wielding a combat knife that looked like a toothpick in his massive gauntlet. Watch Captain Titus stood at the vanguard, his power sword flickering with a dying energy field, his breathing heavy and wet over the Vox channel. They were the Emperor's finest, transhuman demigods of war, but Catachan had ground them down through sheer attrition. Opposite them, perched atop the smoking ruin of the matriarch's skull, the Yautja rose. It was battered, its armor scored and pitted, green blood oozing from a dozen wounds, but it was unbroken. It extended its wrist blades with metallic sheen, the sound echoing with finality. It had survived the monster. It had weathered the fire. Now, it would claim the heads of the angels. Then, the impossible happened. The jungle stopped. It didn't just quiet down. It ceased to exist as a sonic entity. The screaming monkeys, the buzzing carrion flies, the rustle of the wind in the iron bark leaves, all of it was extinguished in a single heartbeat. It was a silence, so profound it felt like a pressure drop in a depressurizing void ship. The predator froze, its mandibles clicking shut. Its head snapped left, then right, its sensory dreadlocks twitching. To a hunter, silence is not peace. Silence is the presence of a predator greater than oneself. The Yautja cycled its vision modes frantically. Thermal, ultraviolet, ultrasonic. Nothing. The forest was holding its breath. Even the Astartes felt it. Valgrd's ears flattened against his skull, the wolf within him whining in primal terror. Something comes, the space wolf growled, his voice barely a whisper. Something old. The shadows at the edge of the clearing seemed to lengthen, pooling together into a darkness that the light of the twin moons could not penetrate. From that darkness, a man walked out. He did not run. He did not sneak. He simply walked, his boots making no sound on the mud that had sucked down power armor and giant beasts alike. He was small, painfully human compared to the towering Astartes and the hulking alien. He wore no carapace armor, no helmet, no refract field generator. He was clad only in a ragged vest, sweat-stained fatigue trousers, and a red bandana that mirrored the one Snake had worn. His skin was a tapestry of scar tissue, a map of every horror this death world had to offer. He held a demolition charge in one hand and a venom-glistening blade in the other. He looked at the massive Yautja atop the dead monster, and his eyes were not the eyes of a soldier. They were the eyes of a shark, black, flat, and devoid of anything resembling fear or mercy. It was Sly Marbo, the one-man army, the spirit of Catachan given flesh. He didn't scream a war cry. He didn't utter a catchphrase. He simply existed, and the sheer weight of his killing intent pressed down on the clearing like gravity. The predator roared, a challenge to this new, small challenger, and leaped from the bone ridge, wrist blades poised to bisect a human. In the air, the Yautja was a blur of kinetic energy, a perfect killing machine. But Marbo did not flinch. He did not even blink. With a motion too casual to be combat, he tossed the demolition charge. He didn't throw at the predator. He threw at the ground where the predator would land. The timing was precognitive. As the Yautja's feet touched the mud, the charge detonated. It wasn't a kill shot. It was a destabilizer. The blast blew the footing out from under the alien, sending it stumbling forward. In that fraction of a second of imbalance, Marbo moved. He was inside the alien's guard before the smoke cleared. He didn't stab randomly. He slashed the tendons behind the predator's knee, ducked a retaliatory backhand that would have decapitated a Grox, and severed the hydraulic hoses of the predator's plasma caster. It was a dismantling. Brutal, efficient, and terrifyingly fast. The predator rolled away, gaining distance, and immediately brought its biomass to bear on the human. It initiated a full physiological scan, seeking a weakness, a fear spike, a hesitation. The HUD scrolled with data, and for the first time in its centuries-long life, the Yautja felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold of space. The readout was flat. Heart rate, steady. Adrenaline levels, baseline. Fear response, no. The scan flashed a single, blinking warning glyph. Threat level, Omega. The human wasn't fighting for survival. He wasn't fighting for duty. He was the environment itself, weaponized. The Predator realized then that it had made a fatal error. It had come to Catachan to hunt the most dangerous game, thinking it was the Astartes. But the Astartes were just visitors. This man was a landlord, and he had come to evict the intruder. Marbo stood amidst the smoke, spun his knife once, and pointed the blade directly at the Predator's masked face. The hunt was over. The execution had begun. The Yautja understood the universal language of violence, and in the stance of the small, scarred human before it, it read a dialect it had rarely encountered, total, unadulterated lethality. There was no fear in the man's eyes, only a hollow, consuming void that promised death. Slowly, with the hiss of pneumatic seals disengaging, the Predator reached up and unclasped its biomask. The helmet fell into mud with a heavy thud, revealing the alien's true face, a grotesque visage of mandibles, flared nostrils, and beady, intelligent eyes set deep in a mottled, reptilian skull. It threw aside its remaining plasma caster, stripping itself of the technological advantages that had culled the Astartes. This was no longer a slaughter. It was a Kagabi Hund, a rite of honor. The alien roared, spreading its arms wide, baring its tusks at the twin moons of Catachan. It was an invitation, a challenge to the spirit of the world itself. Sly Marbo did not roar back. He simply shifted his weight, the Ripper pistol in his hand, remaining holstered. He drew his envenomed blade, the metal dark and stained with the blood of 1,000 Xenos, and cracked his neck. The silence of the jungle shattered as they collided. The fight was a blur of motion that the human eye would struggle to track. The Predator fought with the refined grace of martial artists who had spanned the stars, its wrist blades weaving a tapestry of silver death in the air. It struck with the force of a pile driver, shattering the iron bark trees where Marbo had stood milliseconds before. But Marbo was not there. He moved like smoke in a gale, ducking under swings that would have decapitated a Terminator, sliding to the mud to deliver hamstringing cuts that wept green blood. It was a clash of philosophies, the elegant, ritualistic brutality of the Yautja against the pragmatic, dirty desperation of the Catachan. Marbo didn't block. He redirected. When the Predator grabbed him by the throat and hoisted him into the air, Marbo didn't struggle for breath. He drove his thumbs into the alien's open wound, twisting the torn flesh until the beast dropped him with a shriek of pain. Marbo hit the ground rolling, coming up with a handful of stinging sand which he flung directly into the alien's unmasked eyes. There was no honor in the jungle. There was only the living and the dead. On the periphery of the clearing, the surviving members of the Deathwatch kill team stood as silent witnesses to the impossible. Watch Captain Titus leaned on his power sword, his helmet removed, his face a mask of awe. He had fought demons in the warp and orc war bosses on Armageddon, but he had never seen a mortal move like this. Do we intervene? Brother Valgard rasped, clutching his ruined leg. Titus shook his head slowly. No, look at them. He pointed to the duel. To interfere now would be an insult to the Emperor's design. This is an exorcism. Around them, the jungle began to creep back in, smaller predators drawn by the scent of blood. The Astartes formed a perimeter, not to fight the Yautja, but to hold back the mundane horrors of Catachan, the Rippers, the trapdoor spiders, ensuring that nothing interrupted the duel of the demigods. They fired short, controlled bursts into the undergrowth, acting as the honor guard for a fight that would never be recorded in the Imperial archives. The duel reached its bloody crescendo. The Predator, blinded in one eye and bleeding from a dozen lacerations, managed to catch Marbo with a backhand strike. The blow sent the Catachan flying across the clearing, smashing him into the stone ruins of an ancient temple foundation. Marbo coughed. Spitting out a tooth, his ribs noticeably caved in. The Yautja loomed over him, raising its wrist blades for final execution, a low, clicking emanating from its throat. It was the moment of victory. But the Predator had forgotten the first rule of Catachan. The prey is most dangerous when it is cornered. As the blades descended, Marbo didn't try to block. He lunged forward, inside the arc of the weapon, He buried his knife to the hilt in the predator's abdomen, and then, with a feral snarl, he bit down hard onto the alien's exposed neck, tearing out a chunk of throat. The predator staggered back, gurgling, blue electricity sparking from its damaged armor. In the confusion, Marbo grabbed a frag grenade from his belt, pulled the pin with his teeth, and jammed it into the gap in the predator's chest armor before kicking the alien away. The explosion was muffled by the alien's dense body, a dull thump that blew a hole through the Yautja's torso. The creature fell to its knees, green blood pooling rapidly around it. It looked at the hole in its chest, then up at Marbo, who stood panting, covered in a mix of red and green gore. The predator's breathing was wet and ragged. It reached a trembling hand to its wrist computer. It did not try to heal itself. It tapped in a sequence of glyphs. The display flashed red. A countdown. The Yautja looked at Marbo and did something terrifying. It laughed, a mimicking, distorted laugh that sounded like a human child. The self-destruct, the ultimate denial of the trophy. Marbo's eyes widened. He didn't run. He sprinted at the dying alien, launching a dropkick that caught the predator square in the chest, sending it tumbling backward over the edge of the limestone ravine, down into the deep, dark abyss of the valley below. Marbo turned and dived behind the carcass of the Catachan devil just as the ravine erupted. A miniature sun was born in the darkness, a mushroom cloud of pure white energy rising to consume the night, bleaching the jungle into a monochrome silhouette of destruction. The dawn on Catachan did not bring light. It brought a bruised purple haze that filtered through the smoke of a nuclear fire. The ravine where the Yautja had detonated was no longer a geographical feature. It was a glassy, radioactive scar gouged into the crust of the planet. The shock wave had flattened 3 square miles of iron-bark jungle, turning ancient trees into charcoal skeletons that pointed accusingly at the sky. Yet, even in the heart of this devastation, the planet was already reclaiming its territory. Vines, accelerated by the radiation and the nutrient-rich ash, were already coiling around the blackened stones, their leaves unfurling with an aggressive, supernatural speed. Watch Captain Titus stood at the edge of the crater, his armor stripped of its paint. The ceramite scorched the bare gray metal. He held his helmet in the crook of his arm, breathing in the acrid air. The silence was absolute, but it wasn't the silence of fear anymore. It was the silence of a graveyard. The kill team was alive, barely. Valgr was being supported by Corvus, and Ignis was salvaging what remained of his flamer. They looked less like the angels of death and more like survivors of a natural disaster. Titus activated the servo-skull hovering by his shoulder, its red ocular lens blinking to life as it began to record the official inquisitorial log. Record. Authorization code, Ultima Ocular. Subject, Xeno's incursion, Sector 44 Delta. Status, neutralized. His voice was gravel, worn down by the night's fury. The threat was a singular entity, highly advanced, adaptive, a hunter of peerless skill. He paused, looking out over the misty jungle where the shadows seemed to stretch and move of their own accord. However, the victory does not belong to the Adeptus Astartes. We were merely the anvil. The hammer was something else. Titus deactivated the skull, deciding that some truths were too dangerous for the High Lords to dissect. He looked at his battle brothers. They knew it, too. To report Sly Marbo's full capabilities would be to invite the Inquisition to dissect a hero of the Imperium. The planet itself rejected the invader. Titus amended, speaking to the air. Catachan is not a world to be defended. It is a weapon to be aimed. We are leaving. High in the geostationary orbit, cloaked from the auspex arrays of the Imperial Navy, the Yautja clan ship hung like a jagged shard of obsidian against the stars. Inside the bridge, the atmosphere was somber. The clan elder, an ancient warrior with tusks scrimshawed with a history of 1,000 wars, watched the holographic replay of the final moments. He saw the small, soft-skinned human initiate the close quarters kill. He saw the bite. He saw the grenade. He saw the lack of fear. The elder reached out a clawed hand to the star map hologram. He did not mark the system for extermination. That would be an act of cowardice. Instead, he keyed in a warning glyph, forbidden, not because the prey was unworthy, but because the hunting ground was cursed. The humans here were not prey. They were something the Yautja had not encountered in eons. Equals. The ship's engines flared, turning away from the green hell, leaving the system to its eternal, violent slumber. The hunt was over, but the legend of the demon in the green will be told in the clan halls for generations. Deep within the unburnt section of the jungle, where the canopy was so thick it blocked out the bruised sky, a figure sat on a moss-covered root. Sly Marbo was cleaning his knife. The blade was chipped, the edge dulled by the armor of the star god he had killed, but he honed it with the rhythmic patience of a man who had nowhere else to be. He did not look at the crater in the distance. He did not care about the Astartes lifting off in their thunderous gunship. Beside him, resting on a flat stone like a pagan offering, was a skull. It was not human. It was elongated, reptilian, with 4 distinct mandibles jutting from the jawbone. Marbo picked it up, staring into the empty sockets. There was no triumph in his gaze, only a grim recognition. He wiped a smudge of green blood from the bone, then placed it gently back on the stone. He stood up, blending instantly into the foliage. He didn't take the trophy. The jungle would eat it eventually. Everything returns to the soil. Narrator voiceover. And so, the anomaly was purged. The Imperium's records will state that a Deathwatch kill team intercepted Azino's vanguard and eliminated the threat with extreme prejudice. Statues will be built on Macridge. Hymns will be sung on Fenris. But the jungle knows the truth. The galaxy is a vast, predatory ocean, filled with horrors that defy comprehension. There are things in the dark that hunger for our souls, that view humanity as nothing more than cattle to be harvested. But let them come. Let the monsters of the void descend upon the green hell. For in the shadows of Catachan, they will learn the one lesson that the galaxy has tried to forget. Mankind does not just endure. When pushed to the brink, when stripped of its civilization and its technology, mankind bites back. Fade to black with the sound of a Catachan barking, toad croaking in the distance.